A Lantern, Chapter 4. By the time Abby was 11, she was doing more work. Life was not all play now. One of her tasks was to thread the wicks into the candle molds, for her slim fingers were more agile than her mother's short, thick ones. She had to poke the long wick string through all 6 of the molds and carefully loop the tops over a stick to keep them from slipping. Her mother would then pour hot tallow into the molds and set it away to harden. Abby was always anxious to see the finished product slip out. She would watch her mother plunge the molds into hot water to loosen the hard grease, and then, let me, she would call, and sometimes Maggie Mackenzie would let her carefully work the shining cream-colored candles out of their containers. There were a dozen other tasks for her to perform. Drive the cows to drink, gather eggs from the chickens' stolen nests among the sheds and stacks, and the daily one of going to school. But even work could take upon itself a mask of fun. One could pretend when threading the wicks into candle molds that one was stringing pearls accidentally broken at a ball. That the long walk through the hazel brush to the schoolhouse was between rows of admiring spectators who, instead of a mere rustling in the wind, were whispering, "There she goes. There goes Abby Mackenzie, the singer." For Abby was always singing from the elevation of her grassy knoll in the clearing. It made her happy to walk up the little incline, turn and bow to an unseen audience, throw up her head, and let forth her emotions in song. Her heart would swell in a feeling of oneness with nature and the creator of it, and there would come to her a great longing for things she did not quite know or understand. The log schoolhouse sat in a clearing of timber just out of the river's high water line. The hazel brush and sumac tangled together under its windows, and there were butternut and black walnut trees behind it. The desks were rough shelves against the walls on 3 sides of the room, and in front of them there were 3 long benches of equal height, so that a strapping 6-foot boy or a tiny 6-year-old girl could, with economy, use the same seats. While studying, the children sat with their backs towards the teacher, but when it was recitation time, they had to put their legs up over the benches and turn to face him. Abby always crawled over slowly, holding modestly onto her dress and 3 petticoats. But Regina Deal would flip over daringly in a whirlwind of skirts and pantalets. The cloaks and bonnets were hung on nails on one side of the room, which contained no desk shelf. The water pail and dipper were on a bench by the door, which made a sloppily wet corner, excepting on those winter days when the dipper was froze in the pail. The room was heated by a stove in the center, and one unhappily roasted or froze in proportion to his proximity to the stove. Sometimes the contents of the dinner buckets were also frozen, and one had to thaw them out before eating. On fall days, a few of the more adventuresome of the squirrels and chipmunks whisked in and out of the window opening in the logs, purloining the crumbs for waiting families. In the spring, when the maple sap ran, everyone crossed the river in flat-bottom boats and helped in the little sugar camp. Louise and Regina Deal showed Abby and Mary Mackenzie how to make maple eggs. They took tiny pieces of shell off the small ends of eggs, carefully removing the raw contents, ran the maple sap into hollow molds, and after it had hardened, picked off the shells, and behold, there was a platter of candy ready for winter parties. The fall in which Abby was 11, the entire crowd of young people on the north side of the river was invited to the Mackenzies. Already there was a social distinction being drawn between the north or the countryside and the south or the town side of the river. The party was for Belle, who was soon to be married. Belle had planted her rose bush by the log cabin, but the chickens had pecked at it and the pigs had rooted under it, and no aristocratic gentleman had come by. Only a plain farmer boy who had hired out to Tom Graves. The young folks came in lumber wagons along the river road under the full moon. The few pieces of furniture were set out of doors to make room for the party, and there were tallow candles lighted and placed high upon shelves. In an iron kettle there was taffy cooking to be pulled later, and platters of popcorn balls and dishes of maple drops, into which hickory nuts, butternuts, hazelnuts or walnuts had been stirred. The crowd played dancing games to their own singing and hand clapping. "I won't have none of your weevily wheat, I won't have none of your barley. I won't have none but the best of wheat to make a cake for Charlie." When the fun was at its height, a horse and rider drew up at the door, and someone called out, "Hey there, you!" The young folks, upon going out to see who it was, found Ed Matthews there with a deer carcass, which he had been pulling behind him with a rope. Ed, who was 16 now, was dressed up in city hunter togs, a leather-looking coat and pants and a cap with a long bill in front, whose boots were almost hip-high and fitted snugly to his legs. When they were crowding around to look at the deer, Abby first saw the strap drawn tight on its neck. Immediately she was looking up into the face of Will Deal, a darkened, flashing face. The young folks all discussed the queer fact of the strap being on the deer's neck, but Will Deal said nothing, and Abby, sensing that Will did not want to tell about it, said nothing. Regina and Louise and Mary Mackenzie all invited Ed Matthews into the party. He accepted and immediately became the center of the games and dancing, but for some reason the party was not so pleasant. For some reason, Ed Matthews and his city hunter togs had spoiled the party. When the horses were hitched to the wagons and the young folks were all leaving, Abby touched Will Deal on the arm. "It was your little deer, wasn't it?" "I suppose so." Something intuitive made Abby say, "I'm sorry he was the one who shot it." Will's face flashed darkly. "Aw, shucks, I don't care." But Abby knew that it was not so. Abby knew that Will Deal cared. 2 years later, Grandpa Deal was sent by the county to the General Assembly. Word trickled back to the settlement that he was well liked by his constituents and that he was called Old Black Hawk and the wag of the house. Will Deal, 18 now, had done the freighting from Dubuque all fall during his father's absence. But when spring came, an older brother assumed the business while Will took over the farm work. Once when Abby came by, he stopped the team and sat on the plow handle and called out to her to come and hear a letter from his father. It began, "Dear friend," and ended, "This from your affectionate father." It said that he hoped Will could comfortably till the fields, and that there was some talk of dividing the two counties. That board was tremendous high, $3 a week, that his sister Harriet had left on the stage, that the Pikes Peakers were beginning to run, and that he looked for quite a rush this spring for the gold regions. Abby felt quite proud of the fact that a young man like Will Deal would read his letters to a 13-year-old girl. It was only a few weeks later that an old Springfield friend of Grandpa Deal's was nominated for the presidency of the United States. When Grandpa Deal came home, he said that if you'd have known Abe Lincoln as well as he had, you'd never in the world think he'd have been picked for the nomination. But just the same, there was hoss sense inside his long hide. All summer long, one heard political talk here and there about slavery and secessionists and the outcome of the fall election. Men would stop in wagons on the river road and talk so long that their teams would amble a short way into the woods, cropping at the juicy ferns. Grandma Deal scolded all summer about it. Abby heard her say that she kept dinner hot so many times for Grandpa, who was talking to groups around the store, over in town, or on the schoolhouse steps, that she had a notion to quit cooking for him altogether. All winter the talk grew thicker and more heated. While Abby did not fully understand it all, she knew in February, when the Southern Confederacy had been established, that things were at some sort of crisis. But from hearing Grandpa Deal talk, she felt confident that when Abe Lincoln would take his seat in March, everything was going to be all right. And Grandpa Deal was to have plenty of time to talk, for his old job of freighting from Dubuque was to be taken from him. Slowly but surely, the construction of the Dubuque and Sioux City Road was being carried westward. Abraham Lincoln took his seat in March, but everything was not going to be all right. 27 days later, the first iron horse from Dubuque shrieked its triumphant way across the Deal farm and on into Cedar Falls. The old-time freighter's task was finished. The train's arrival was timely for the community, inasmuch as events were to follow which would suspend construction and cause Cedar Falls to remain the western terminus of the road for 4 years. Abby had now passed her 14th birthday. On an April afternoon, with the river high and the clods of snow still at the roots of trees, she went into the timber to look for anemones and Dutchman's breeches, for dog-tooth violets and the first signs of mayflower buds. Coming out on her own particularly grassy knoll in the clearing, she went up to the hillock in one of those moments of desire to let out her feelings in song. To the squirrels she may have seemed an ordinary girl clothed in a green checked gingham dress, with reddish-brown curls twisted up into a snood, but the squirrels were not seeing correctly. For Abby knew that she had a dark velvet dress that swept around her feet, a string of pearls on her neck, and in her hand a hat with a sweeping plume. She was holding it carelessly at her side with her long, slender fingers that tapered at the ends. At the top of the knoll she turned. A sea of white faces looked up at her. To the casual observer it might have seemed a mass of wild plum blossoms. Even before she sang, the audience applauded vociferously, and a few people stood up. An onlooker who was not magic-eyed might have thought the wind merely blew the blossoms. Abby bowed and smiled, waited for her accompaniment to begin. She fingered her pearls, and smiled at the girl at the reed organ. All at once she realized that the girl at the organ was a talented orphan from whom she had been befriending. It made her feel happy, light-hearted. She threw back her head and began singing. O Lady of the Lea, fair and young and gay was she, beautiful exceedingly, the Lady of the Lea. The song embodied for her all the enchantment of the Arabian Nights. It opened a door to a magic castle. It smelled of perfume and spices. It stood for wonderful things in life to come. Many a wooer sought her hand, for she had gold and she had land. Her voice rose melodiously high, sweet and true. Everything at her command, the Lady of the Lea. Her heart seemed bursting with love of the trees, the sky, the melody. O Lady of the Lea, fair and young and gay was she. There seemed a gleam ahead of her, a light that beckoned. A little will-o'-the-wisp out there beyond the settlement in the big woods. It was something no one knew about. Mother, nor Mary, nor Belle. Only for her it shone, for her and other lovely ladies. Fanciful exceedingly, the Lady of the Lea. When the song had died away, and Abby bowing to the invisible audience, she heard it. Abby! Oh, Abby! Hoo-hoo! Mary's voice was calling and crying in the distance. She slipped out of the clearing, climbed the sake and rider fence, and saw Mary coming, calling and crying and coming towards her. Abby, they just got word out of Dubuque that Fort Sumter was fired on. Abby clutched her. What does that mean, Mary? It means, Mary's voice whispered hoarsely. Grandpa Deal says it means war.